Okay, here we go. You probably noticed I tried to make it look like it was a different day by putting a cardigan on. But you'll notice, same shirt as last video. I didn't have the ambition to go like change to make it look like it was a different day. I'm just trying to do as much as I can in one day. And look, Ms. Kalashnikov would be so disappointed. Look down here. Like she thought the bookshelf was dirty. My pile of junk is stacking up so it's now like actually in the video. That being said, let's learn things here. So what were we talking about last? Right. Okay. So we were talking about DNA, function of DNA. Learn that DNA builds proteins, and proteins do all of the work in your cells. But you probably also know that DNA actually like makes us who we are. So how does it go from DNA makes proteins, but DNA also makes me look this way? Like I mentioned last time, my mustache doesn't connect. That's because of my DNA. And like, it doesn't even connect in the middle. So frustrating. You think you're going to be able to grow a sweet beard, and then it's just like thin and straggly and gross. And then there's like the worry of every person, which is like, am I going to go bald? Right? Is that in my DNA? Like, am I going to lose my hair? Because this is not going to look good being bald, right? And then like, why is my hair so straight? And like, why are my eyes so bad? All these things. Well, this is my DNA. And so that's what we're going to learn about today. So we're going to learn about how does your DNA actually determine who you are and why you have the traits that you do. But to understand this, we need to talk a little bit about something called cell division. And so I threw this picture over on the side here so you could see. Let's look at this one where it looks like all these like squiggly things are moving apart from each other. Well, these things are moving apart from each other because these cells are splitting in two. And we're going to learn more about this process a little bit later. But when your cell, either let's say part of your body gets damaged, or let's say your cells start to get old, or something is growing like you probably are right now, or when a living thing is producing sex cells like sperm and eggs, cells will need to divide and make copies of themselves. So think about like you get a cut, then you need to actually fill in that cut with other skin cells. So your cells will divide to do it. Your skin also gets worn off really quickly because it's on the outside and constantly needs to be replaced. Like you replace your skin like once every couple of weeks. And so your cells divide to make extra copies. And every living thing starts as one single cell and grows to be what they are today. So this is no different for you or like plants or things like that. And that means that you have to get bigger, right? You are bigger than a single cell. Now there's something else that happens during this, and that is that the nucleus of the cell dissolves and goes away. Now that's important because when this happens, your cell needs to protect that DNA. And so the DNA scrunches up together to make something called a chromosome. And so this is an example of a chromosome. You see it's like this bunched up squiggle. Well, that squiggle is the bunched up DNA all squished together. And they tend to look like this, where they have like a top and a bottom and a pinched in narrow little middle. These chromosomes are what we looked at in the previous slide, the little like globby looking things on the inside of those cells. They were the things that were actually exposed, and that's because the nucleus is no longer present inside of the cell as it divides. So the DNA scrunches into a chromosome to protect itself, and then that's when you actually get to see chromosomes. Now, every living thing has chromosomes. And what you notice on the left here is that those are diagrams of what you would see for human chromosomes. Humans have 46 chromosomes. That means 46 strands of DNA in every single cell. Now, chromosomes, you would often say that humans don't have 46. You would say that they have 23 pairs. And the reason why is because chromosomes come in pairs. You'll notice that there are two essentially like matching chromosomes for every single number here to make up 23 pairs of chromosomes. Now, here's the reason why, is because you get one chromosome from your mother and one chromosome from your father. Same with this chromosome number 2, you get one of these from your mother, one of these from your father. And that's the case for all of your chromosomes. You get one of those chromosomes from your mom, one of those chromosomes from your dad. Now, each of those chromosomes carries information, but it essentially carries almost exactly the same information. So they might both have the same gene on them, but they might be slightly different genes depending on what your parents had for their information in their DNA. Now, one thing I hope you notice is that there are 22 pairs that match each other. Those are what we call the autosomes. The autosome chromosomes are the ones that essentially kind of match each other. They all carry the same information, but there are also ones down here that are called the sex chromosomes. Sex chromosomes determine your biological sex. So what that means is if you inherit what are called the X chromosomes, let's say you get 2 of those, you would be XX and biologically would develop to be female. If you inherit, let's say, an X and a Y, then biologically you would develop to be male. Now, you may immediately now have like thousands of questions. You're like, what happens if this person has this trait? What happens if this person has this trait? How does this person get this trait? I don't know. I'm not like a geneticist. I'm just teaching grade 9 here, guys. But, you know, there's lots of things that can change with your chromosomes. And I'll mention a few as we go through the course. But there's a lot of things that are more complicated than we're making it seem because DNA is more complicated than it seems. Okay, so we've talked about how you have these chromosomes, and I left them up here in the corner so that you can take a look at them. But as we talk about these chromosomes, then hopefully you can see from the way that they're set up, and like I mentioned last time, that each of these comes in a pair. And one thing I was kind of mentioning is that this pair, you inherit one of these from your biological mother and one of these from your biological father. They also carry essentially like information for the same thing. And so let's just pretend for a second. Actually, you know what? We don't even need to pretend. We talked about some different proteins. We talked about keratin. So let's say there is a keratin gene on this piece of DNA. And that is the part that's going to tell the cell how to build keratin. But on the matching chromosome, this is also a keratin gene. See, they actually carry the same information. And so when we're talking about those chromosomes up in the corner there, well, those chromosomes are able to carry information for the same trait, just they might carry slightly different information. So if you are carrying 2 sets of information, let's think about this for a second. I mentioned that they might be slightly different. So we mentioned that like hair is made out of keratin. And my dad's hair is black. And my mom's hair is the same color as mine, like this light, it's not blonde, but it's not like brown. It's just like, it's kind of that in-between thing. And why do I have that kind of hair then? Why didn't I get black hair? What decides which trait or which protein actually gets built, and how does that actually work? Well, you see, when your DNA condenses, a bunch of those genes kind of like squish into the same area, and that kind of ends up determining some of the traits. So let's think about like flowers. They're no different. They have DNA, they build proteins, they do it all the same kind of, except they're just like making sugar out of sunlight, like reverse burning the air, doing amazing things, being plants. So let's say they have flowers, and their flowers could be, let's say, different colors. Maybe there's like purple, maybe there's white. Well, this little section where a bunch of genes clump together, let's say they actually determine if something is purple or if something is white. They determine your traits. Traits are your characteristics, so like the way that you look, maybe parts of the way that you behave and the way that your body functions. And I mentioned that there's different versions. Well, those different versions are what we call alleles. I know it looks like allele, but it's not allele. It's an allele. And so alleles and the way that they combine is what determines what traits we get. So my combination of alleles from both my mom and my dad gave me hair that looks the way that I do. Their combination of alleles made my mustache not connect on the sides and in the center. It's ultimately that combination of alleles that determines how something is going to develop the traits that it has. So let's think about this for a second. There are different versions of traits, and we're going to talk about two different versions. We're going to talk about dominant alleles. So what does it mean to be a dominant allele? Well, it means that you essentially overpower any other version of allele that is present. So when we talk about a dominant allele, we're talking about the fact that you have two alleles for every trait. And let's say you have a dominant version, well, it's going to cover up or like mask that other trait that might be present in your cells. And so, sorry, we'll go back to the camera here. So the other type of allele is what's called a recessive allele. A recessive allele only shows as a trait if there is no dominant allele present. Okay, let's give an example so that this makes a little bit more sense. Let's talk about having three different situations, or actually we'll talk about one trait. And we'll talk about, let's pretend eye color. And we're going to say for eye color that brown is dominant, and blue is recessive. Okay, so we're totally going to oversimplify a lot of DNA as we do this, because you know there's not just like two eye colors. There's not just brown and blue. There's like a whole range of eye colors. And think about things like skin color. There's a huge range, and even hair color, hair structure, thickness, curliness, all these things are so much more than just like two traits. But for the purposes of learning this, you got to pretend that there's just two traits for now. Okay, so if you're thinking like, well, I have green eyes, like, how do green eyes just pretend? We're pretending the world doesn't have green eyes right now. Okay, so just go with it. We can deal with that other stuff a little bit later. All right. So let's think about the way that this will work. Well, there are two different types of alleles, dominant and recessive, and there are two different versions of traits that you can have. Either brown, which is the dominant version, or blue, which is the recessive version. I'm just going to see if I can focus that. No, I can't. Okay. That's what you get. You get a slightly out of focus picture. So that means that you are going to have essentially three situations. You could have a person who inherits their two alleles, and they are both brown-eyed alleles. Essentially, this person inherited two dominant alleles. But then let's think you could also have somebody who inherits their two chromosomes, and instead of having two dominant alleles, this person is going to inherit one dominant and one recessive, one brown, one blue. They have one dominant and one recessive. But then you can also have a person who inherits their two alleles, but this person inherits two blue-eyed alleles. They have two recessive alleles. Those are really the three situations that we have. You can either have situation 1, two dominants, situation 2, one and one, situation 3, two recessives. We actually give each of these their own name because of how prevalent they are, or like the way that these end up working. So the way that we name these, if you have two dominant alleles, we call that homozygous dominant. Why do we call it that? Well, just so you know, the prefix homo means same. The ending zyg or zygos means pair. And so when we say homozygous dominant, we mean same pair of alleles, and they're both dominant alleles. Homozygous, same pair, dominant. You could also have two recessive alleles. So we would call that person homozygous. Oh, there's a G in there. Zygos recessive. And let's think about what the name means again. Same pair recessive. Homozygous recessive. Now, let's say you would have one dominant and one recessive. Well, you do not have homozygous because you don't have the same. You instead have heterozygous. Well, what does that mean? Hetero as a prefix means different. But zygous still means the same thing. It means pair. If you are heterozygous, you have a different pair of chromosomes. One thing I hope you notice, I didn't write dominant. There is no such thing as heterozygous dominant, heterozygous recessive. You can just say heterozygous because it means you have one of each chromosome. So now let's think about this for a second. We know the names of these different things. We know what alleles they actually have, but what would they actually look like? Well, this person here has two dominant alleles, so they are going to show the dominant trait. In this case, this person is going to have brown eyes because brown is the dominant trait. This person, they have two recessive alleles, so they have no choice but to show the recessive trait.
So what color eyes do they have? They have blue eyes. But what about this person? This person has two. They have two different versions of this allele. And I can already hear somebody shouting. I can see that Deshita has dislocated her arm trying to answer this question already. But if you were thinking, well, they probably have green because that's like partway in between. They actually don't, because remember, we're in a world that has only two colors of eyes, brown and blue. We're making this simple. Dominant traits hide any other trait that exists. The dominant covers up the fact that they carry information for blue eyes. So it means that they show the recessive trait. Oh man, sorry, dominant. What am I thinking? They show the dominant trait. It's one of those moments where your like mind wanders. So this person has brown eyes. I also just like my blue pen. I think it looks really cool. Okay, so when you are heterozygous, because you have a dominant allele, you show the dominant trait. This is just a mess. I'm sure writing over top of it more made it better. Now, the fact that they show these different traits, what you actually look like, is called your phenotype. The trait that is expressed. So for myself, when I talked about my hair, my phenotype is the color of hair that I have. For our people in our example, their phenotype is the colors of eyes that they have. Phenotypes are what we actually end up seeing. I like to think of them as your physical type, your phenotype. So that is a great way to remember what this actually means. Now, when we're dealing with genetics, though, we usually end up, it's kind of a pain to write out little drawings of these different chromosomes and try and show what things look like this way. So what we end up doing is we give letters to abbreviate what genes or what alleles somebody has. And so the way that we do that is using the same letter, but capital and lowercase. And so when you have dominant alleles, you show that using capital letters. So this person has two dominant alleles, so I would draw two capital letters. This person has two recessive alleles, I would write two lowercase letters. This person has a dominant and a lowercase, so you write a capital letter next to a lowercase letter. Notice that I use the same letters every time, A's, but I just changed whether they were capital or lowercase. When you have heterozygous, we always write the dominant letter first because it hides the recessive one. Okay, just a quick tip for you here. Pick letters that are different from capital and lowercase. Nobody wants to look at your S's because your S, you may see the difference between capital and lowercase, but I don't. Your S looks the same whether it's capital or lowercase. Same with your C's and your, I don't know, whatever else is like that. Use letters that are different. Use A's or B's or D's or E's or Q's or whatever it is. Just pick letters that have different capital and lowercase, okay? Please, that's for me. Remember, we're all here for me, so help me out. This set of letters is what we call the genotype. Your genotype is the alleles carried in a cell. great way to remember it is your genotype is your genetic type. So the letters that is given to an organism to represent their alleles is called their genotype, but the trait that they show is called their phenotype. And so this ultimately determines why we have the traits that we do. It determines why your hair is the way that it is. It determines why your metabolism works the way that it does. It determines so much about the way that your body is built and structured and works, and sometimes even the way that an organism can behave. But I know what you might be wondering now, like, well, if I have like a parent who has a dominant and they both have dominance, and then like, how come I have like the recessive trait? Well, that's what we're going to take a look at next, because you can use this information to make predictions about what an organism will actually look like. So check out the next video and you'll get to see that. In the meantime, thanks to Starbucks for someday sponsoring me in the future. Look forward to our partnership.